there's a lot of information out there, as you can imagine. We live in an information world these days, and some things you can believe and some things you can't. And there's a lot out there. Surprisingly, not a lot about diabetes and lifestyle and diet. And diabetes is an epidemic, and I hope to point out to you guys in the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. We're going to have a couple of short videos at the end. And so we'll just proceed from there. So you may have caught my pun title here, kind of giving away a little bit of my steam, but we've known for a while, especially with type 2 diabetes, that it is a disease of insulin resistance, not a disease typically of insulin insufficiency. And what causes insulin resistance is what I'm going to be talking about. So traditional medical training, and I love this slide because it kind of says it all to me, but sometimes I feel like I'm a highly trained gardener who received little to no training on soil. We're experts on the fruit, the leaves, the branches, and the trunk, but we don't typically tell you why. I don't know if you've had chronic disease before, if you've gone to your doctor and you get, well, this is associated, this is kind of, you never get a full answer as to why this happened to me, other than maybe a few bad lifestyle. But why did that bad lifestyle cause the problem? So my goal is really on a daily basis to learn as much as I can about the soil so that I can teach what it is that we need to be doing that we're not doing. And my message, hopefully, there's a lot of complexity to nutritional science, but my goal is to really make this so simple that my grandkids can understand it. Well, we just went out. Okie doke. Let's see what. Okay. We may. I'm plugged in over here. I don't know. This may or may not work, guys. So ancient wisdom. If you read the first bullet point, that comes from Genesis, and that's actually the reason why the Seventh-day Adventists are the healthiest group of people on planet Earth. They took this to heart, and they believe that, at least in their training, a lot of Seventh-day Adventists don't follow this completely. But if you look at the Loma Linda, California Adventists, their population has been heavily studied through years. They're one of the original 5 blue zones, if you've heard of blue zones. And they live typically, on average, about 10 years longer than their California cohorts, who live longer than most Americans do. So it's not just that they're living longer; their vitality into their 80s and 90s is maintained. Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. Is generally attributed to Hippocrates from 2,500 years ago. You've heard of the Hippocratic Oath that we take. A lot of what we take as a Hippocratic Oath now is the do no harm, which is great, but we don't. They took out a lot of the original Hippocratic Oath on food, unfortunately, about 100 years ago. And another scriptural point that the body's a temple, and that we need to treat it as such. And I guess we're now, let's see if this will work from here. Here we go. So the best diet for diabetes, and this is one of the slides that's going to frustrate the heck out of me, because mostly you still see this in hospitals, and a lot of dietitians teach this, that it's all about limiting your carbs. Count your carbs. This many grams, that many grams, and it's junk. It's not true. It's not. In type 2 diabetes, carbs, not all carbs. Yes, of course, candy bars and cakes and cookies, we all know that's not good for you, okay? But the lowest incidence of type 2 diabetes on planet Earth comes from the people who eat a higher percentage of carbs in their diet than any other people. So it's clearly faulty thinking, and I'm going to get into the why it's faulty thinking in a little bit. So which of those are best? Obviously, a whole food, plant-based Mediterranean-style diet is much better approach to type 2 diabetes. The goal today is to get you to understand the soil of type 2 diabetes and get you understanding the concept of insulin resistance. How many of you have not heard of insulin resistance? Okay. Most people have, but I'm glad that hopefully at the end of the day you'll understand that that is the driver of our epidemic, is insulin resistance. In other words, in type 2 diabetes, especially early on in the disease, your body's making actually more insulin than it's ever made before. It's trying to keep up with the demand because it's not working. It quits working, and that's what we call insulin resistance, that the body is resistant to the action of insulin. So what is insulin? Insulin is, as you may know, is a hormone secreted by the pancreas. Think of insulin as a key to the cell. So in other words, everything we eat, whether it's fat, protein, sugar, whatever it is, has to be broken down to glucose to be used as energy. Glucose is the final breakdown product that gets into the cell that generates energy and allows us to live. But it can't get into the cell unless the receptor, the insulin receptor, that is unlocked by insulin. In type 1 diabetes, which, you know, I've got one grandson who has this, so I'm not only professionally but personally familiar with type 1. It's a different disease, okay? This typically occurs from an autoimmune process early in life. We used to call it juvenile diabetes. We're not 100% sure what causes this. There are genetic factors, there are environmental factors. There is evidence that women who breastfeed, as opposed to giving cow's milk, that there's a protective. We don't know whether it's the dairy doing the harm or the breast milk providing the protection. It's probably a bit of a combination of both. As I've said many times, dairy milk is a great food for baby cows, and that's the extent of it. It's an autoimmune disease, meaning that the body attacks the pancreas, and so in fairly short order, the body has no insulin. And so type 1 diabetics typically are going to need insulin for the rest of their lives. We found recently actually that high-carb, whole-food, plant-based diets actually reduce insulin requirements in type 1 diabetes also. So in type 1, we still do have some degree of insulin resistance, even though it's primarily a disease of insulin deficiency. Gestational diabetes, I'll just hit quickly. You may have heard this. You get high glucose during the stress of pregnancy. It may affect the mother and the child. It usually disappears after pregnancy, but it does elevate the risk of type 2 diabetes later on in life. I don't know how much of that is physiological and how much of it is just the fact that it's clearly associated with being a little bit overweight. Type 3, this may be a term a couple of you may have heard of. It's an emerging term that we use to describe insulin resistance when it comes to dementia. We clearly know that type 2 diabetes is linked to a doubling of the risk of dementia, and a lot of this is due to inflammatory changes and insulin resistance. So what is diabetes? And so these are numbers, I think these are fairly conservative numbers, to be honest with you. I'm not a big fan of the word pre-diabetes. It implies that there's nothing wrong. And clearly, by the time somebody is diagnosed with pre-diabetes, they're already significantly insulin resistant. In fact, even if you have a normal A1C, if you're carrying some extra abdominal obesity, you likely have some degree of insulin resistance already. It's just not diagnosed by pre-diabetes, by your A1C. And for those of you who may not be familiar with A1C, it's a blood test that measures your average glucose over a period of about 90 days, or roughly. But these are the abstract, or the actual numbers. Pre-diabetes is typically on most assays somewhere between 5.7 and 6.4. So formerly we called type 2 diabetes adult onset. When I started practice, I don't think I ever saw somebody under the age of 30 with type 2 diabetes. Now you see it in school age 6th, 7th, 5th, 6th graders because of obesity and because of the significant rise in obesity in kids. They get insulin resistant and they develop type 2 diabetes. Fortunately, if you get a hold of these people and get them on the right lifestyle, it is highly reversible early on. 90% of all cases of diabetes are type 2. So most of what I'm going to be talking about today is type 2. And the good news about type 2 is you can reverse it. It's been known for a couple of decades that type 2 diabetes, it can be completely reversed with lifestyle. And as I said earlier, type 2 diabetes, the insulin levels, if you just draw a blood insulin level, which you don't normally do, but if you did draw a fasting insulin level on somebody with type 2 diabetes, the likelihood is their levels are going to be high because their pancreas is working extra hard to try to get more insulin into the system to unlock that key on the cells. And it's just, because it's not working, the body sends a signal to keep producing more. After a while of type 2 diabetes being unmanaged or having A1Cs in the diabetic range for 5, 10, 15 years, the pancreas does eventually wear out. And so, there does come a point where insulin is going to be required in type 2 diabetics, but it takes a long time. And even in that situation, you can reverse your insulin requirements. So I've already said that. So usually no symptoms during insulin resistance. This pretty much says what I just said. But so insulin resistance can lead to fatty liver disease, elevated triglycerides, elevated LDL cholesterol, hypertension and heart disease, what we call metabolic syndrome, which is rampant in the United States right now, and it is a huge driver of chronic disease. So we want to try to find insulin resistance as early as we can. So this is a way we kind of do it. So what is insulin resistance? It begins as saturated fat depositing in your muscles, abdominal area, in the organs, in the liver, and it creates an environment where insulin's less effective. So how do you know if you're insulin resistant? Well, there's no real good blood test for this, but the best one I've found is the simplest one. If you're getting a lipid profile, which almost everybody gets these days as part of their annual physical, you can calculate your own ratio. They don't normally calculate this on a lipid profile, but if you look at your triglyceride number and divide that by your HDL number. So in other words, let's say your triglyceride is 150 and your HDL is 50. Your ratio is 3 to 1. That's starting to get insulin resistance. Typically you want that number around 2, and if you can get it less than 2, that's great. That more likely than not means that you're not suffering from much insulin resistance. Pre-diabetes, the blood glucose levels start to rise. It's present in 1 in 3 Americans and almost half of people over the age of 65 in the United States. If that's not an epidemic, I don't know what is. By the time you get to type 2, you're starting to get the excessive urination, some of the symptoms that you get from diabetes. We always used to say polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia, excessive thirst, excessive and eating more and urinating more. There is a family history component to this, no doubt about it. Like I said earlier, history of gestational diabetes, being overweight or obese, a diet that's including highly processed and that is low in fiber and low in whole food plant-based foods, a sedentary lifestyle. Ethnic minorities, I don't think this is genetic. Native Americans and African Americans do not, who live in especially African Americans or Africans who live in sub-Saharan Africa do not get type 2 diabetes until they come and start living an American lifestyle. So I don't think that this is primarily genetic. I think ethnic minorities have a higher incidence of this because of their diet quality, their poor access to healthier whole food, plant-based foods, and a lot of conditioning. And some of this has to do also with access to health care, although I think a lot of it has to do with food deserts and things of that nature. Polycystic ovarian disease is another increased risk factor, and obstructive sleep apnea, clearly a link and an associative risk for type 2 diabetes. So what are the complications? Your heart, your blood vessels in your brain, your eyes, your kidneys, your nerves, your peripheral artery disease, amputation. We all know this, but I think it's important to have a slide to just remind us of how dangerous this is. You know, we talked about hypertension for years as a silent killer. There's no bigger silent killer than diabetes. So as I said earlier, it doubles your risk of dementia, especially when diagnosed under the age of 55. It doubles your risk of heart attack and stroke. Your cancer rates are increased, especially colorectal, breast, pancreatic, and liver, bladder, endometrial, liver, and probably some others. Those are the main ones. You also, if you get cancer, you're more likely to die from it if you're diabetic. It diminishes your immune response, and that plays into all these other risks. I know I'm seeming like the angel of death here, but the news is going to get better, because guess what? We do control our fate here. So the COVID pandemic, and there's a lot of data that's now that we're 5 years and just came on our fifth 5-year anniversary. I think everybody remembers what they were doing 5 years ago today. But when you look at the COVID patients who did the worst, and we look at COPD, we looked at obesity, we looked at all these different independent factors, diabetes was the #1 factor for morbidity and mortality in patients, even with patients with pre-diabetes. It was the #1 predictor of mortality, followed by emphysema, believe it or not. So again, 7th leading cause of death, that is extremely underrepresented, because if you have heart disease and you're diabetic, I mean, what's the chicken and what's the egg? And, you know, it might not appear on your death certificate, but it clearly played a role. As I said earlier, almost half of adults age 65 or older either have pre-diabetes or diabetes. It's just incredible. And many people are walking around. Of all the people who have diabetes, 23% of adults don't even know they have it. Worldwide, these numbers are striking. By 2030, I won't go into all these, but by 2030, it's expected that about 500 million people worldwide will be diagnosed with diabetes, and probably another billion will be pre-diabetic. I'm not going to talk much about the meds. They have their place. I'm not anti-drug. Lord knows I've prescribed tens of thousands of drugs through my years, and I'm not even against some of the newer GLP inhibitor receptor agonists, like Ozempic and Wegovy. These are promising meds. They have some of the same effects on the body that a healthy diet has. Unfortunately, what we know about the weight loss drugs in particular that are primarily diabetic drugs is that the effect of them, and so you'll see all this data leading up to about 1.5 years of use of these. We don't really know. In fact, we know that there's a plateauing effect of these after about 1.5 years. So not only are they expensive, but let's just say you do lose 30 or 40 pounds on these over 1.5 years, and you're down to a better weight, but you're not where you want to be. The likelihood is that that's the plateau, and that you're not going to achieve any more weight loss after that. So what's human nature? After 1.5 years, you keep taking it, you don't see any results. What do you think is going to happen? Probably a lot of those people are going to stop it And what we know is when people stop these meds, their weight creeps back up. And let me just warn you that yo-yo weights are worse than if you did nothing at all. Losing weight and gaining weight, especially as we get older, is a bad recipe, because what happens is you're losing water and muscle mass along with fat, and as you gain weight back, you're gaining more fat than you're gaining muscle mass, especially as you get older. So my advice is, unless you're committed to taking these drugs for the rest of your life, don't start them. And be wary of the fact that what's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years from now, the honest answer is nobody knows. So I'm not against them, and certainly for people that have tried everything, they're a nice adjunct. They do not replace lifestyle. So other lifestyle things are important. Activity, moderate activity, walking, 150 to 300 minutes. I don't time this out, but I think if you're walking 30 minutes every day at a moderate pace, or 3 or 4 times a week, and you're doing more, if you're going to the gym or you're getting a little more activity, that is awesome. It's improving your insulin sensitivity. It will definitely improve your glucose management. Yoga. There's a good therapeutic trial from the NIH from 2018 showing that yoga helps. You might ask yourself, why? How? Couple of reasons. Number one, if you've ever done any movement yoga, there's some exercise involved in most forms of yoga. And you're reducing stress hormones, and stress hormones are clearly linked to increased blood glucose. So never forget the stress effects on type 2 diabetes. And it clues me to remind myself to mention why African Americans and Native Americans might have a higher incidence of type 2 diabetes. There's a lot of stress involved in being in one of those two groups, believe me. I can only imagine it as a Caucasian person, some of the disadvantages that lead to that and lead to higher stress. Maybe you're living in neighborhoods that aren't as safe. This chronic stress causes a hormonal release from our adrenal glands that causes our blood sugars to go up. It's part of our fight or flight evolution of how we stayed alive when we were the prey and not the predator. But it doesn't serve us at this point. So yoga is one of those things. Relaxation activities are extremely important in maintaining glucose. So it's not just about the food, it's about the movement, it's about stress reduction. I get asked about intermittent fasting a lot. I thought I would just briefly mention it. It does have some promise. If you're not familiar with this, limiting your calories to a certain point in time in the day. Some people say that they eat from noon to 6 p.m. and fast for 18 hours. There's some evidence to show that this might help in A1Cs. There's no good long-term studies that you're reducing your long-term risk of disease. You might be. You're going to probably improve your weight some. As far as its long-term maintainability, I don't know. I do think it's a good idea to give your gut some degree of rest. So I do recommend not eating past 6 or 7, if you're on a regular schedule, not eating past 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And then if you can delay your first meal of the day to 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, you're probably not going to feel too much pain from that. A 13, 14-hour fast and drinking plenty of water, you're probably not going to notice very much distress from that. So it's a good add-on. I'm not against it, and we'll see the long-term effects of it and how maintainable it is. Some people like to use vinegar, a teaspoon or two of vinegar. That I've heard that before. It does have some positive effects, most likely on the gut microbiome. If you want to add a tablespoon of vinegar, if your stomach doesn't bother, it's an acid, so remember that. It's not a magic bullet, but I've had patients ask me about it, and it does have a little bit of benefit, but don't forget the 99%. That's just because I get asked about it more than anything else. If you're wondering why you don't get a lot of healthy nutrition, if you're not hearing a lot of people saying what I'm saying to you today, all you got to do is look at show me the money. I've got another slide on my Blue Zones talk where I show me the money. And it's right there in front of you, even the American Diabetes Association, the dairy industry. There is a lot of powerful lobbying and money out there to protect the interest of animal agriculture, dairy agriculture, the egg board, the pharmaceutical industry. You know all about all that. Even the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics gets a lot of funding from questionable sources. I'm a student of history. I love history. I've always been a history nut, even since high school, because I believe we learn so much from past mistakes. And I've been told that in 1964, when the Surgeon General issued his first warning on cigarettes, and the first warning started to go on cigarette packaging, there were 8,000 medical studies that linked smoking to lung cancer before that was issued. So I'm always asking myself, how many medical food, dietary, lifestyle studies are we going to need before there are warning labels on foods that clearly are linked to disease? And the answer is probably 8,000. If history is any judge, it's going to take a lot to overcome this type of corporate messaging. One of my favorite slides in the world. I get emotional almost when I see this, because this is one of the greatest epidemiological studies that's ever been done. This was published in the Journal American Medical Association over a decade ago, so this is should be widely known. This is a study of the Seventh-day Adventists, and they have been studied as a group since probably the 1950s. And so what we find is, looking at dietary patterns, not so much, one particular food item. We look at overall patterns of eating as to our best guide. And the great thing about the Adventist, I showed you the biblical phrase that they look to, but only about 9% of Seventh-day Adventists are total vegans. Another 10 to 20% are lacto-ovos, they eat a little bit of dairy. Another 10 to 20% are pescos. Another 10% or so are semis, and about half of them are omnivores. They eat pretty much everything. They tend to eat much healthier than the average American. There's not a lot of Adventists eating Twinkies and Oreos. So the non-vegetarian Adventist prevalence of diabetes is only about 7.5%. But their lifestyles, the Adventists are a very, very close-knit group of folks. It's one of their benefits in that they support each other. They're a very tight-knit group. They tend to be very active. Their lifestyle is very, very healthy. They are very selfless in their community involvement. They tend to be very, very regular churchgoers. So they have a very strong spiritual community. There's a lot to be said for their lifestyle. I don't know anything about their doctrine, but I just know that their lifestyle is really based on solid science. But the great thing that makes them such an important group of people to study is because they're all of the factors that made them into one of the original Blue Zones. They all do about all of that. They avoid alcohol. All of the 9 tenets of the Blue Zones, they're virtually 90+% of them go by all of those other 8 things besides their diet. The diet is the one variable. And anytime in medicine we see a group of people that are doing all the same things, and the only one difference is their diet, that makes them an ideal group of people to study, because you can factor out all of the other things about diet, and you can look and see, you can follow them over decades, which they have been followed decades and decades and decades and decades about their life, about their dietary patterns. And what we see is a roughly 3-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in the non-vegetarians over the pure vegans. The lacto-ovos go up about 10%. You can see it's almost like a stair step. And the fascinating thing about this, you can pull up a graph of hypertension, which is another great marker for chronic disease, and it is this exact same stair step increase. So that tells me, as we add animal protein and animal fat into our diet, we increase the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and all the other chronic disease markers that follow along with it. This says the same thing virtually. In this one, that's a duplicate side. We don't need to spend time on that. What we know is from the Adventist Health Study, another way of saying what I just said, strict adherence to a whole food plant-based diet reduced their risk of type 2 diabetes by 74%. One serving of meat per week for every serving resulted in a 29% increase in type 2 diabetes, and one serving of processed meat went up even more by 38%. Those are pretty incredible numbers. The Nurses' Health Study, if you're not impressed with the Adventist, the Nurses' Health Study has been going on since 1976. They've had 3 phases to date, and clearly greater than 5 servings of meat per week versus less than 1 serving per week. When you compare those two groups, there's a 59% difference in their prevalence of type 2 diabetes. It's just striking when you look at these numbers. So this is to give you some heart on how quickly your insulin sensitivity can go down with a very healthy diet. This is an effect of a 16-day near vegetarian diet on insulin use and mean insulin dose in men with type 2 diabetes. So this is men who are on insulin, taking type 2 diabetes, taking insulin for type 2 diabetes. And you look over on the left and you see how much their baseline insulin was, the number of them who are on insulin, and their insulin dose. And you get a roughly half of the dose and the number of people who are actually even taking insulin just in 16 days of adhering to a very strict whole food plant-based near vegetarian diet. So it works quickly. I suspect that the baseline of those men and their diets were pretty poor. To see that just to warn you, that doesn't always look that great, but that's pretty impressive. You might ask, why does diabetes do so much damage in the body? And there's an emerging understanding of systemic, what we call chronic inflammation. Inflammation is a marker for emerging understanding of all chronic disease. If you look at heart disease, if you look at cancer, if you look at dementia, and you get into the soil and you go, how did this actually start? We're learning more and more about how the gut microbiome and what we eat causes a chain reaction in the body to either reduce inflammation or cause it. And virtually everything we eat, you walk in the supermarket, every single food item, save for about 1 or 2% of them that are kind of in the middle, are either causing inflammation or they're fighting it. It's not complicated. So lipids in type 2, we know that this driver of insulin resistance also is associated with high cholesterol levels. We know that this causes fat deposition in tissues, muscles, organs, and is responsible for what we call the metabolic syndrome, which is a deadly triad of obesity, insulin resistance, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. Actually, 4 things. So what's the problem with carb-restricted diets? The biggest, and let me start with a caveat. Okay, we're going to call these by their name: Atkins, keto. Everybody's rebranded this over the years because these diets work great for weight loss. They cause the most rapid weight loss of any other diet. Strict carb restriction. Problem is, you're losing a lot of protein, muscle mass, and you're losing a lot of water. That's their secret sauce of keto diets. is the water loss. If you look at a keto diet compared to a healthy Mediterranean or plant-based diet, the weight loss numbers aren't that different at about 3 to 4 weeks. And the sustainability of low-carb diets. Look, we are hardwired to be, I showed you earlier, everything has to be broken down to glucose. So we naturally come with carb cravings. It's not something to necessarily fight. Just remember that God's carbs and man's carbs are two different food groups, okay? But I'm sure you've probably all had, and I've even had dietitians tell me about, don't eat, there's certain fruits that you should steer clear of. There's certain grains you should steer clear of because they're high in carbs, and I just want to beat my head against the wall because it's just leading you down the wrong rabbit trail. Many, even endocrinologists, don't distinguish between a carb is a carb is a carb. How many times have I heard people say that? If I could use a swear word and not be caught on YouTube, I would, but it's horse hockey, okay? It's not true. The body digests a candy bar a lot differently than it does an apple, okay? And they're both pure carbs. Well, the candy bar has fat in it too, so it's sort of a double-edged sword. I've never seen a patient, maybe some of you can point me to somebody who's told me they started Atkins or they started a low-carb diet and then 5 years later had sustained this. I just don't see it sustainable. Most people, after about a year, the weight just starts gradually coming back on because that carb addiction is hardwired into us as human beings. Low-carb diets, in one meta-analysis that was done 5 or 6 years ago, leads to increased mortality. I'm convinced it's because of the increase. In order to eat a low-carb diet, you really have to depend on a lot of animal products to get your calories up. Where else are you going to get it unless you're just eating vegetables all day? So we're going to end. Where are we time-wise? I'm getting better at this. So we're going to have a couple of videos from Michael Greger, who's one of my teachers. I love somebody that claps Michael Greger because he's probably the most important doctor that I ever started following about 10 years ago. His original book, How Not to Die, many of you have read. How Not to Diet, he's written, How Not to Age. But the original one, How Not to Die, struck me in so many ways because Michael is an internal medicine doc just like me. He spoke the same language I spoke, and he took each disease and pointed out all of the information that was already available back in, I forget, 2015 or so when he wrote the original book. But he has these great little vignettes. If you're ever curious about any disease and you want to go to nutritionfacts.org, it's right there. He puts all this out there free of charge. So it's a nonprofit. I'm going to finish with 2 videos of his on diabetes that have been out there for a while, but I just think this is a good way to finish up on, and then I'll give you one study that's going to really blow your mind. So does the clicker work? Nope. Let's try. Yes, ma'am. Right. If I said opinion, I'm wrong. It's science.
Studies dating back nearly a century noted a striking finding. If you take young, healthy people and split them up into 2 groups, half on a fat-rich diet and the other half on a carb-rich diet, within just 2 days, this is what happens. The glucose intolerance skyrockets in the fatty diet group. In response to the same sugar water challenge, the group that had been shoveling in fat ended up with twice the blood sugar. As the amount of fat in the diet goes up, so does one's blood sugar spikes. It would take scientists nearly 7 decades to unravel this mystery, but it would end up holding the key to our current understanding of the cause of type 2 diabetes. When athletes carb load before a race, they're trying to build up the fuel supply within their muscles. They break down the starch into glucose in the digestive tract. It circulates as blood glucose, blood sugar. and is taken up by our muscles to be stored and burned for energy. Blood sugar, though, is like a vampire. It's an invitation to come into our cells, and that invitation is insulin. Here's a muscle cell. Here's some blood sugar outside, waiting patiently to come in. Insulin is the key that unlocks the door to let sugar in our blood enter the muscle cell. When insulin attaches to the insulin receptor, it activates an enzyme, which activates another enzyme, which activates two more enzymes, which finally activates glucose transport, which acts as a gateway for glucose to enter the cell. So insulin is the key that unlocks the door into our muscle cells. What if there was no insulin though? Well, blood sugar will be stuck out in the bloodstream, banging on the door to our muscles and not be able to get inside it, so with nowhere to go, sugar levels would rise and rise. That's what happens in type 1 diabetes. The cells in the pancreas that make insulin get destroyed, and without insulin, sugar in the blood can't get out of the blood into the muscles, and blood sugar rises. But there's a second way we could end up with high blood sugar. What if there's enough insulin, but the insulin doesn't work? The key is there, but something's gummed up the lock. This is called insulin resistance. Our muscle cells become resistant to the effect of insulin. What's gumming up the door locks in our muscle cells, preventing insulin from letting sugar in? Fat. What's called intramyocellular lipid, fat inside our muscle cells. Fat in the bloodstream can build up inside the muscle cell, creating toxic fatty breakdown products and free radicals that can block the signaling pathway process. So no matter how much insulin we have out in our blood, it's not able to open the glucose gates and blood sugar levels build up in the blood. This mechanism by which fat, specifically saturated fat, induces insulin resistance wasn't known until fancy MRI techniques were developed to see what was happening inside people's muscles as fat was infused into their bloodstream. That's how they found out that elevation of fat levels in the blood causes insulin resistance by inhibition of glucose transport into the muscles. And this can happen within just 3 hours. But one hit of fat can start causing insulin resistance, inhibiting glucose uptake after just 160 minutes. Same thing happens with adolescents. You infuse fat into their bloodstream, it builds up in their muscles and decreases their insulin sensitivity, showing that increased fat in the blood can be an important contributor of insulin resistance. Then you can do the opposite. Experiment lower the fat in people's blood, and insulin resistance comes right down. Clear the fat out of the blood, you can clear the sugar out of the blood. So that explains this finding. On a high-fat diet, a ketogenic diet, insulin doesn't work as well. Our bodies are insulin resistant. But as the amount of fat in our diet gets lower and lower, insulin works better and better. This is a clear demonstration that the sugar tolerance of even healthy individuals can be impaired by administering a low-carb, high-fat diet. But we can decrease insulin resistance, the cause of prediabetes, the cause of type 2 diabetes, by decreasing saturated fat intake.
Apologize for the volume. It's as high as I can get it, so we're technically challenged on that.
Studies dating back nearly a century noted a striking finding. If you take young healthy people, split them up into
All right.
There are all sorts of different scoring systems to rate diet quality. My favorite, for simplicity, is the dietary fuel formula. That's a fancy name for a simple concept. It's just the percentage of your calories from whole plant foods, so 0 to 100. The average American diet has a score of 12 out of 100. So like on a scale of 1 to 10, our diet is a 1. You can split people up based on how they score and show how the higher you score, the better your metabolic markers when it comes to diabetes risk. There appears to be like this stepwise drop in insulin resistance and insulin producing beta cell dysfunction as you eat more and more plant-based. And that highest group was only scoring about 30, less than a third of their diet was whole plant food, but better than the lowest, which was down around the standard American diet. No wonder. Diets centered around plants, emphasizing legumes, beans, cookies, chickpeas, lentils, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, and discouraging most or all animal products are especially potent in preventing type 2 diabetes, and as a little bonus, has been associated with much lower rates of obesity, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, cardiovascular mortality, and cancer. And not just preventing type 2 diabetes, but treating it as well. A systematic review meta-analysis found that the consumption of vegetarian diets is associated with improved blood sugar control. But how much improved? Here's one of the latest trials. The effect of a strictly plant-based diet centered around brown rice, done in Asia, versus the conventional diabetic diet on blood sugar control in patients with type 2 diabetes. A 12-week randomized clinical trial. For the diabetic control diet, they set up food exchanges and calculated specific calorie and portion controls, whereas on the plant-based diet, people could eat as much as they want. That's one of the benefits. The emphasis is on food quality rather than quantity, and they still actually lost more weight. But even after controlling for the greater abdominal fat loss in the plant-based group, they still went out. Of course, it only works if you actually do it. But those that pretty much stuck to the healthier diet dropped their A1C levels 0.9%, which is what you get taking the leading diabetes drug, but of course with good side effects. Yeah, but would it work in an underserved population? The impact of a plant-based diet support program on mitigating type 2 diabetes in San Bernardino, the poorest city of its size in California. A randomized controlled trial, but not of a plant-based diet itself, as the title suggests, but of just an education program telling people about the benefits of a plant-based diet for diabetes, and then it was up to them. And still got a significant improvement in blood sugar control. Here are the numbers. I got a little better in the control group, but way better in the plant-based instruction and support group. And more plant-based diets are not just effective in the prevention and management of diabetes, but also its complications. Check this out. One of the most devastating complications of diabetes is kidney failure. This shows the decline in kidney function in 8 diabetics in the 1 or 2 years before switching their diets. They all showed a steady, inexorable decline on a fast track to complete kidney failure and dialysis. But then they switched to a special supplemental vegan diet, and their kidney decline was stopped in its tracks. Imagine if they had switched a year or 2 earlier. Most diabetics don't actually end up on dialysis, though, because they die first. Cardiovascular disease is the major cause of premature mortality among diabetics. And that's why plant-based diets are perfect. There's a general scientific consensus that the elements of a whole food plant-based diet, legumes, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and nuts with limited or no intake of processed foods and animal products are highly beneficial for preventing and treating type 2 diabetes. Equally important, plant-based diets address the bigger picture by simultaneously treating cardiovascular disease, our #1 killer, along with obesity, high blood pressure, lowering inflammation, and we could throw cancer into the mix to our #2 killer. The bottom line is that the case for using a plant-based diet to reduce the burden of diabetes and improve overall health has never been stronger.
So I'll add this to the body of evidence that just came out in Lancet. This will be the final slide. You may not be familiar with the Lancet, but it's probably the most prestigious medical journal in the world. At my nutrition conference in DC last year, the chief editor gave the keynote speech and was telling us how on track we were with teaching lifestyle medicine to people and the plant-forward, whole food, plant-based diet and lifestyle associated with that, and hinted to the fact that they've been looking at a number of studies through the past number of years. Well, in January of this year, literally a month or two ago, they came out with their meta-analysis of meat consumption and type 2 diabetes. So if you're not familiar, the scientific term for a meta-analysis is a study of studies. So essentially what they did over a period of, I believe this was over roughly a decade, they looked at 31 different studies from 21 different countries representing almost 2 million people. And the two main clear links to increased association with type 2 diabetes were number one, processed meat, and number two, other meats such as steak, burgers, what's technically called unprocessed meat, although if you see what's being fed to cows and pigs, to me calling that unprocessed is a bit ignorant. Animal protein is highly processed. It's just processed through the animal. But the two biggest contributors associative-wise with type 2 diabetes in this study of studies, over 2 million people over a decade, corroborates exactly what Gregor's been saying, corroborates what Neil Barnard said in his book, Reversing Diabetes, over a decade ago, that the biggest contributor to the type 2 epidemic in the world, number one, processed meat, number two, meat, to a lesser extent, chicken. The chicken data was a little less certain. There is a clear link, but it's not nearly as strong as the other two groups. They didn't really look at any of the other food groups. I'm pretty convinced that especially since dairy and cheese is the highest percentage source of saturated fat in the diet, that the same would hold true for cheese, but they didn't really look at that in this meta-analysis. But this is why I entitled this talk, Meet the Enemy, M-E-A-T, because this is true, and we just have to face the facts. And there's a lot of headwinds to this. If you're familiar, and I'll finish on this point, if you're familiar with the USDA comes out every 5 years with their power plate, you can see a version of it right over there. We used to have the food pyramid, if you're old enough for me. Remember the pyramid, and at the top of it was kind of confusing because at the top of the pyramid was all kinds of junk you shouldn't be eating, but it was like, okay, eat the good stuff and still treat yourself. That's fine. Look, I'm not here to kill anybody's joy. I'm just here to teach you the science. The plate started about 15 years ago, largely in part to the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, of which I'm a very proud member. And over the years, that plate has gradually increased on the vegetable side. And if you'll look to the lower right-hand corner of that, in 2020, so it comes out every 5 years. In 2020, this came out. Actually, the USDA, this is the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. Up in that upper right-hand corner, that appendage that says water, the USDA one actually says dairy. It's not on the plate. It's sort of like an appendage, and all it was a wink and a nod to the billions of dollars spent by the dairy industry to hang on to providing dairy in school lunches. Healthy protein is listed, and so that's generally, you think of lean meats as being your source of healthy protein. So every 5 years, there comes a new iteration of this, and so there's a scientific panel of medical experts, nutritionists, dietitians, doctors, teachers. All of the people who study this stuff get together for roughly 2 to 3 years prior to the recommendation. So this is the committee, the panel, that recommends to Congress updates every 5 years to this plate. And you may say, well, what difference does the plate make? Who's going to really look at this? Well, a lot of federal funding, school lunches, the way nutritional science is taught in medical schools, in dietetics, all of the teaching comes, at least in part, from these recommendations. And so the scientific panel came out with their report in December of 2024 to give Congress a chance to digest the new plate. And so what's happened is the vegetable plate continues to enlarge, the fruits are still there, and the healthy protein has now changed. First of all, the dairy is gone. The little appendage on the upper right is gone, and so the beverage of choice is water, which is what Harvard put on there 5 years ago. So the beverage of choice is now water, and under the healthy protein, there were about 5 items that were moved from the vegetable category over to the healthy protein. Beans, legumes, lentils, vegetable sources of protein which contain plenty of amino acids, including soy products. And they are now listed as the primary choice for healthy proteins are now, by the panel, has recommended that those be listed in priority as the #1 source of where we get our protein. Meat's not been eliminated from it, but it's losing its place gradually. Now, all of you know the mess that is in having politicians decide what we should be eating. They are heavily influenced by lobbies. If you're familiar with the Whole Milk Act, that didn't quite make it through Congress last year, but they got lots of votes on both sides of the aisle to put whole milk back in schools, which has been out of schools for a while. It's strictly because of influence of money. So I would just leave you with the thought of we're on the way, but if you have any influence or you want to call your congressman or whatever, please ask them to just go by what the scientific panel said on this and don't muck it up with any favors to anybody. Go with the science and not with your own pocketbook. So that's pretty much concludes type 2 diabetes talk, and we can shut the video off.